This interview was a part of the Oklahoma Historical Society's Oral History Program Living Legends collection. There is no original date given for this interview. The interview was conducted by Mrs. Mary B. Roberts. The interviewee is Mr. Chauncey Abraham Border, and that's capital Chauncey, Abraham, Abraham, Border, capital Bord, as in Daisy, ER, of Tulsa, Oklahoma. This material is being re-recorded on the 30th of October, 1986, for inclusion in the permanent collections of the Oral History Program by Judith Michener.
There's a tribute to this gentleman that I am to interview, given by Mr. Bryce C. Roby, one of the businessmen who had been a leader in the Chamber of Affairs, wrote of him, quote, "I can remember back when the Chamber, as far as our company was concerned, was just another expense. It was you, Charlie, who taught me that the Chamber of Commerce was an expense if I did not add my efforts to my money. As I think of the guidance you have given me in my civic growing up, I think of a man who can look at a glorious city and say to himself honestly, a great part of this growth I nourished. It is a part of me, and I, in turn, am part of that city. He is the man who has accomplished results without worrying about where the credit will be given. He can share the credit with anyone. In fact, he can share it with all the members of the Tulsa Chamber of Commerce and have more left over than any other man in Tulsa today. I would like for you now to give us your name and your birthplace and take it from there, please. Mr. Barter.
Thanks very much for reading Bryce Roby's nice letters. It's nice to have friends who will say good things about you, because some people don't say all good things. My full name, believe it or not, is Chauncey Abraham Border. I'm known as C.A. Border, usually Abe. Now, the interview has asked me this question: why do they call me Charlie? Well, that goes back to one day when our old friend Dr. W.E. Grissow was making a speech before the Tulsa Chamber of Commerce. He wanted to say something nice about me, but he forgot my name, so he called me Charlie. And everybody enjoyed it so much the name stuck. But nevertheless, it's a good name. Now, to get on with my life history, let me say this. I've worked with organizations all my life, mostly as a professional secretary. So the things I'm going to tell you are not things that I did, but things that were done through organizations with which I worked for the best interests of Tulsa and Oklahoma. To begin with, let me say I was born in Strasburg, Ohio, August 17, 1890. That makes me old enough to talk to a historical society. I graduated from Colorado College in 1915 and then enlisted in World War I. Rose as high as a first lieutenant. I came to Tulsa in 1918. Now, the reason for coming to Tulsa was that in Colorado College, I met a girl by the name of Rose Gill from Bonita, daughter of Judge and Mrs. Joseph A. Gill. And so, to be nearer to her, I came to Tulsa. No sooner did I get to Tulsa than I began working in organizations. I first became a member of the American Legion. A group of us organized the American Legion, Joe Carson Post number 1, and I was charter member number 4. Then I joined an organization called Secotym Club, Secotym. That was a YMCA group. In a very short time, this group was dominated by young men who returned from the armed forces. And we got interested in forming the Junior Chamber of Commerce. Another man, N.A. Thompson of the YMCA, and I were selected to go to St. Louis to the first caucus of the Junior Chamber. We came back and organized the Junior Chamber here in Tulsa. It was the first one in the state. I was chairman of the organization committee meeting, and the meeting was held on March 9, 1920. I was on our first board and became its paid secretary on April 18, 1920. I served for 18 months. Married Rose Gill and went with the Chamber of Commerce. I might say this junior chamber business is important to Oklahoma because it brought the national headquarters of the JCs to Tulsa, which is now a permanent institution here. Then I went with the Chamber of Commerce, was with them for 38 years. I worked on highways, water resources, area relations, and aviation. I was in on the organization of the Tulsa Farm Club and was its president in 1964. I was president of the Tulsa Rotary Club in 1959, 1960. Then retired because of old age and the rules of the Chamber of Commerce, and went with the Arkansas Basin Development Association as secretary from 1959 to 1969. All along the line, I worked with organizations and formed some, like the Oklahoma Hereford Breeders Association, the Oklahoma Angus Breeders Association, the Oklahoma Pecan Growers Association, and a half a dozen highway organizations. In this way, I got to know the people of the state like nobody's business, and I loved the whole thing. Now, I think maybe the interviewer had better say something here and give me a chance for my breath.
Mr. Border, I was impressed with, in reading some of the clippings that I found on you, I was impressed with this, what you call the stud horse notes. Oh, could you explain that a little bit more to us?
That is a subject that should be made a matter of history. The story goes something like this. Back in Pennsylvania, the Pennsylvania Dutch farmers needed better horses. None of them had enough money to buy a good stallion. So they would get together, and each farmer would sign a note for $2 or something like that, and when they got about twice as much as was needed, they'd turn it over to the local bank, and on the strength of those small notes, called stud horse notes, they would buy a stallion. And then, as these farmers bred their mares to this stallion, they would pay their fee to the bank until the bank got his money back and got his interest. And that, ladies and gentlemen, was a stud horse note. But to bring it down to the growth of Tulsa, here's how we worked it here. At the time, we got around to bringing Spavinaw water here, which of course was the biggest thing that ever happened here in the city.
We want to know some more about that.
I'll tell him about Spavinaw water a little later. When we found out where it was to be, where the Tulsa end was to be, the business leaders of Tulsa, through a committee in the Chamber of Commerce, decided they would buy land for a park where the Tulsa end of the Spavinaw line would be. So they got a real estate man to block up 2,000 acres for a ranch. And when he got the options all lined up, they exercised the options, and the different men had signed up, some for 10,000, most of them for 5,000, and a lot of them for 1,000. It was quite a trick taking that note around from office to office and selling men on signing a note for so much money. But we got it, and today one of the biggest municipal parks in Oklahoma, Mohawk Park, is a result of the first stud horse note. Then came the time that aviation became terrifically important, and everybody said you have to have an airport. A committee from the Chamber of Commerce headed by J. Frank Matchett appointed a sites committee composed of the big men of the city, Bill Skelly, Wade Phillips, Cy Avery, A.E. Bradshaw, and men like that. It was a secret committee. They brought men in from all over the United States who knew something about airports. And you know what happened. Everybody that had a piece of land wanted to sell it to for the airport. And if it ever had leaked out where the site was they selected, the prices would have quadrupled. So this group kept it very quiet. They brought a real estate man, A.H. Burgess from Wagner, Oklahoma, in, and he blocked the land up, and they signed stud horse notes. Again, my job was not to sign the note because my name wouldn't have been worth 15 cents. But I could carry it from office to office and have these businessmen sign it. And again, they signed some for 10,000 and on down to a few of them for 500. We didn't get enough money, and Wade Phillips raised the ante. He crossed out his name, which was for 10,000, and rewrote it for 20,000, and turned it over to Bill Skelly and says, "Match me." And Bill matched him, and that put it over the top. So with those two men in for $20,000, it gave it confidence, and the rest signed up just like sheep follow their leader. And incidentally, a copy of that note, or that note, is framed and hanging in the office of the Tulsa International Airport. That was the most important stud horse note we ever had. Then we had a couple others of some interest. When the time came that we wanted to build the Tulsa stockyards, we got the land all right, but we couldn't get the money to build the buildings. Again, the stud horse note was used, and we got the buildings, and the stockyards are there. Now, my interviewer is smiling about this, but I'll tell her about something she knows more about. There came a time in the history of Oklahoma when we just didn't have enough money to build roads. One day, an engineer from Kansas City came in and proposed that for $30,000, he'd make a study of a turnpike from Tulsa to Oklahoma City. And providing we could get Oklahoma City also to put up $30,000. We got the gang together. And again, we used the stud horse note idea and signed up, took it to the bank and got our $30,000. Took this man to Oklahoma City where he interviewed Governor Roy Turner, and then went over to see Stanley Draper, and Stanley used the same system of getting a stud horse note, and the bank advanced the money. The survey was made, and today these folks who are taking this interview came over on the Turner Turnpike. So that was a pretty good deal. Now, I don't want any questions asked at this point, because there were some of these stud horse notes that didn't work out quite so well. Now, interviewer, what else do you have to say?
I've been told what not to ask. I notice here that it says the boosters brought water from Spavinaw Creek in 5-gallon bottles and offered the passers-by a free drink of clear sparkling water from a spring-fed stream. Was this publicity or a necessity?
It was a necessity which led to publicity. The saddest story in Tulsa's history was when the Arkansas River water got filled with volcanic ash. That was before the days when they built the dam up in Colorado. Its name has slipped me just now, John something Dam. But our water was so thick you couldn't even take a bath in it. And it was a time when people would go to the various springs around Tulsa and buy water in 5-gallon bottles and put it in a top of an ice box. Now, this is before the day of refrigerators. This is the day of ice boxes. It was quite a trick to lift the 5-gallon bottle of water up and set it on the ice box. The leaders of Tulsa realized that if Tulsa was ever going to grow at all and not just wither on the vine, they had to have a good water supply. So a group of men, it'd be impossible to name all of them, but Cy Avery and Al Farmer were two of the leaders, formed the Tulsa Ozark Club, built a private club up on the upper reaches of the Spavinaw River, Creek rather, and began selling the idea of bringing Spavinaw water to Tulsa. Incidentally, one of the leaders was a man by the name of John R. Hadley. He got the idea that he'd let the people try Spavinaw water. So we set up stations on the street, and they brought this water in 5-gallon bottles and gave people drinks. It was quite an interesting program. Incidentally, the Junior Chamber of Commerce that year showed its mettle by doing more than anybody else to carry the vote. So Tulsa did bring Spavinaw water to the city, which made the city of Tulsa. Incidentally, the Daily Oklahoman carried a story entitled, "Tulsa Drowns a Town to Get a Drink." And that did a lot of good toward getting interest and getting the vote carried. Spavinaw water made Tulsa, and now the coming of navigation is going to give it its second glorious boost. All right, here you are. Now the interviewer has asked me two questions. First, I want to tell you about the Junior Chamber of Commerce. Back in 1921, they had a special committee set up as follows: gathering data regarding smoke prevention with the ultimate hope of keeping our city clean. So you folks who study ecology must remember that Tulsa Junior Chamber of Commerce had that in mind way back in the 20s. Now, I've been asked to tell something about making the Ozarks a place for living. The Ozark Playgrounds Association, headed by Marie Kolb of Joplin, was a very, very famous organization. It was set up primarily for the purpose of bringing folks into the Ozark region, Missouri, Arkansas, Oklahoma, and parts of Kansas, for hunting, fishing, and camping. They did a good job. It seemed to me that probably rather than bringing in tourists, the Ozark region had greater opportunities for gracious living than anything else. So I telephoned my friend Marie Kolb and asked her if she'd let me on their next program. And the meeting was going to be in Joplin. She gave me the luncheon period, which was the best period. And I delivered my address on gracious living in the Ozarks. When I finished, well, fortunately, I had copies made, mimeograph copies. When I finished, a little man started up through the audience. I found out afterwards he was Clarence Burns, newspaper editor from Fort Smith. And Clarence paid me the greatest compliment I ever had for a speech. He said, "I'm going to run that speech complete in 3 parts in the Fort Smith newspaper." About this time, a little old lady came up, and believe it or not, it was Mrs. Fulbright. Mrs. Fulbright's mother ran a newspaper over in Arkansas, and she was an active member of the Playgrounds Association. She says, "This gracious living in the Ozarks is what I'm interested in. I'm going to print that speech in full." Gee, did I swell up with pride. And then that speech was made many different times. Arthur Black of Tulsa made it several times. Bryce Roby made it several times. But incidentally, today, the Ozark region is becoming a great region for gracious living. Now, I think I've exhausted that subject.
Perhaps. You spoke of this speech there. I noticed in some of the notes that I've gone through that you sometimes wrote speeches and then persuaded someone else to give them. Were you kind of the power behind the throne on these?
No, it's very simple. First of all, you don't do that except on something that's extremely worthwhile. For example, on this water program, the city of Skiatook suffers as much as anybody else from floods. Every time they get a heavy dew, they have a flood. And it's very serious, and they can't get Skiatook Dam built. So it was necessary to stir up some interest up there, get some news that would get back to our senators and representatives and the Corps of Engineers. So I concocted this idea. I'll give you this as an example. I went to John W. Story, Jr., a very active man in this water program, told him I wanted him to make the speech. And I told him I'd write most of it. And he said, all right. And then I called the Skiatook Chamber of Commerce and asked them if they wouldn't give us a date. And J. Milton Patrick, incidentally, past national commander of the American Legion, was very enthusiastic for it, as was Bill Wright of the newspaper. So Jack Story made the speech. Now, incidentally, Jack didn't use my speech. He took that as the background, and he finished up with this sentence, which I think was great. He said, in years to come, you'll look back on this Skiatook program and say, I'm proud I was part of that group. That's about the way we handle it. You do it for water programs. For example, Jay Walker, who was one of our leading citizens, made many speeches before 4-H and FFA. And when before Jay'd make a speech, he'd call me and ask me to tell me the occasion and asked me for some suggestions. Well, of course, this gave me a great opportunity to get my stuff out. And then sometimes I didn't even wait to be asked. I'd find a subject I wanted a speech delivered on, and I'd get my material ready, and then I'd find somebody. Well, I'll give you a good sample. On this water program, we had a little difficulty with the lawyers. I don't know why the Bar Association caused us so much trouble, but they had more people in the Bar Association that doubted our bringing navigation to Tulsa than anybody else. So I went to the chairman of the program committee of the Bar Association, David Hall, who is now governor of the state of Oklahoma, and asked him if he would give me a place on the program if I would get a good speaker, and told him what it was about, and David said yes. And then I went to Tom Brett, who many of you know, a very prominent lawyer, son of a prominent lawyer, and our interviewer is nodding that she knows him. I went to Tom and announced that he was going to make the speech. And whoever heard of a lawyer that would back down on making a speech? So I gave him the information I thought was good. I wrote part of it. Tom wrote part of it. And you know, he did a whale of a good job. Oh, I think that's enough.
Well, a few weeks ago, they carried a story on the Arkansas River project and its opening at Caucus, and that we are now a port city. I have an idea you could tell us something about that.
It's a long story. Way back before World War I, chambers of commerce with folks like Colonel Douglas in Tulsa and folks like that all up and down the river would go to Congress to try to get money to improve the river. The main thing they wanted to do was get money to remove snags. That's S-N-A-G-S, old logs that floated down the river and would puncture the bottoms of flatboats. They didn't do very well. Tulsa would go back to Congress, and then Little Rock would go back to Congress, and then Pine Bluff would go back to Congress, and we didn't get very far. One day, a man back in Washington told Colonel Douglas, "You're wasting your time. Each town coming back by itself. You get the governors of Arkansas and Oklahoma each to appoint 3 men to speak officially for the state, and then have them come back and tell what they want, and I believe Congress will listen." With that in view, Bob Kerr was governor. I can't think offhand who the governor of Arkansas was, they appointed the Tri-State Committee, or the Bi-State Committee, and that's when the thing began. The Corps of Engineers did not approve of the program, so we had to raise.
It couldn't be done.
Yeah, they said it couldn't be done. So we had to hire private engineers, a fellow by the name of Brent from New Orleans, I think was the principal one, to have new studies made. And finally we got the thing in pretty good shape. When Hoover was president, he saw a flood and he promptly announced that something different had to be done, and that was the opening of the door. And then when Bob Kerr was governor, they had the big flood. And the folks in Tulsa got him in an airplane and took him over all that flooded area. And those of you who know Bob Kerr knew how excited he got and said something had to be done about it. And well, frankly, he was the bull elephant in leading in the fight for the money. And the first barge moved in December 31st, 1970. We had the dedication just a week ago, just last Saturday. And they're moving in merchandise from all over the state. For example, newspapers. Milt Phillips Seminoles getting his newspaper print to come from back in Tennessee. It goes up the Tennessee River to the Ohio River, down the Ohio River to the Mississippi River, down the Mississippi to the Arkansas, up the Arkansas, and verdigris to Tulsa. Incidentally, the Daily Oklahoman and Oklahoma Times gets its newsprint that way.
And cheaper?
Oh, much cheaper that way. So it's really a big event. I don't know what all to say. It's one of those things that you work on for generations, and thousands of people work on it, but it's a success today, and we'll give it the final dedication on June 4th and 5th when President Nixon is supposed to make a speech. It's a great event. It's going to help Oklahoma a lot. For example, the wheat growers state that the reduced rates they've gotten on account of the compelling navigation has totaled better than $6 million net to them each year. So it's a big thing. Steel's coming in for our highway bridges and all that sort of thing at reduced rates. So everybody's benefiting from it. By the way, let me tell you a funny story. Flint Steel Company is one of our big steel companies here. Yeah, Charlie Ganaway's company. Interviewer seems to know Charlie Ganaway. I'm being interrupted. It's all right. The Flint Steel Company bid on a contract to make tremendously big tainter gates for use up on the Ohio River at some dam. I can't tell you how big they are. I didn't bring any records. But here's the dope. They're bringing that steel from Pittsburgh to Tulsa by barge. Flint Steel will fabricate it into tainter, T-A-I-N-T-E-R gates, and they'll be shipped back. I think Uniontown is the name of the dam where it's going to be shipped, and they'll do it at a profit. Now, they can only do that because of this river navigation. All right, you take it.
You were mentioning Mr. Ganaway, my reaction to that. I knew he had been the mayor here for, I believe, 2 terms. Was it more? 1. I've forgotten just how many. Oh? No. Am I wrong on that? Correct me, please.
You know, she's got Charlie Ganaway wrong. She knows Mr. Ganaway and Beebe's wife, but Charlie was never mayor. Charlie was executive vice president of the Flint Steel Company, and he was president of the Arkansas Basin Development Association 2 years, and as such, he worked hard on this water program. And now has his own business in connection with steel fabrication.
My connection with Mr. Ganaway is not as close as it has been with Beebe, of course. She and I were interested in the SIGEPs. Both of our boys were SIGEPs and roommates down there, and that's where the tie came. That my mistake was innocent.
She talking about her acquaintance with Beebe on account of her fraternity. 3 of the directors of the Arkansas Basin Development Association, Tom Jolly was one of them, and I've forgotten who the other 2 were. So this is a small world after all.
Well, we thank you so much for this. Can't you think of something else that you would like to relate to us about? Well, you haven't even told us about the lady behind all this now, whom you married and when it occurred and something of your married life.
You're getting into a rather personal deal now. In college, I met Rose Gill, daughter of Judge and Mrs. Gill of Bonita, Oklahoma, and that's how I happened to come down here. I married her at June 15th, 1921. So this June, we're supposed to have a 50th wedding anniversary, but she says no. It worked like this. I stood up in front of the preacher and promised to support her till death do us part, and I'm still working at it. I have a daughter in Portland, Oregon, and a grandson who is smart as hell, and I guess that's about all.